Before I start my talk, I have a plug for help that I'm going to ask for, sort of related to this talk, but a little bit of a different effort. Colorado Parks and Wildlife is getting started on a seed mix app. So this would be something that could help you if you're a landowner or a project proponent and you're trying to figure out a good seed mix for your location. You enter your county, your elevation, and some very simple soil attributes, and then the app would spit out a list of appropriate species and cultivars for your location. So to make this a really great tool, we need as much input as possible. And if you have ever put seed on the ground and had any success whatsoever, and you can remember the location of that spot, I would love for you to be part of our input group. Jim's got the sign-up sheet there, so he's gonna pass that around. And I appreciate it if you would be willing to be a part of this. Over the next 6 to 9 months, we're gonna be just trying to get as much expert opinion as possible to make that as good of a tool so we can actually report on what people actually have seen work and have success with. So moving along to my talk, I'm going to talk about sagebrush from seed, what it takes. And this is synthesizing some research from about 12 years. I've worked with a lot of people, but I wanted to point out 2 collaborators from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Arvin Archer and Derek Lavoie, as well as 2 people that I worked with from CSU, Cindy Brown and Phil Chapman. So this was the study area for a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about in the Piceance Basin in northwest Colorado. This photo is looking east along I-70 near Rulison, and the area ranges in elevation from about 5,000 feet to almost 9,000 feet. And the sage-grouse habitat in this area is at the highest elevations, where I think it's the most similar to what you have here in the Gunnison Basin. So I'll try to focus a little bit on that. But we did a whole array of experiments over the whole elevation range, and we planted sagebrush over that whole elevation range and had success with sagebrush coming up from seed at 12 different sites. One thing that I found, though, was that weed control was important even at the highest elevations, which I wasn't expecting. And mainly it was cheatgrass that was a problem. And when you're thinking about sagebrush and trying to establish it from seed, you have to remember that the sagebrush seed is extremely tiny. There's about 250,000 sagebrush seeds to a pound of sagebrush seed. So when you have a seed with that small of a reserve to germinate from, it can't compete with very much. It definitely can't compete with weeds. It has a hard time competing with grasses and even with forbs. So that's just something to remember. And then with cheatgrass in particular, it's a tough problem because the cheatgrass plant is such a prolific seed producer. So if you have a cheatgrass dominated site, you might have upwards of 1,900 seeds per square foot. So that's not very much area for that many cheatgrass seeds. You know, a 50% cheatgrass cover site might have somewhere around 350 seeds per square foot. To put that in perspective, if you're trying to establish a really competitive grass, you need to get it down to like 4 seeds per square foot of cheatgrass, or you're going to have trouble with establishing your competitive grass. So even if you did 99% control on a really cheatgrassy site, you still have too many seeds to establish a competitive grass, and you probably need to do way better than that for sagebrush. But that's the negative part. The good part is, you know, we've had some discussion about the resistance and resilience and how that increases with more mesic conditions and higher elevations. Here in the Gunnison Basin, you've got a little bit of elevation, you got more mesic conditions, so it's not quite this dire. This is some data from our higher elevation sites. This was from like 7,000 to 8,500 feet, 3 different sites that are averaged over. And we're looking at cheatgrass percent cover. And at this site, we did an experiment where we tried just to seed or not seed at all. And for right now, don't worry about the dashed line versus the solid line. I'll come back to that. But so we were looking at the natural potential for recovery of these severely disturbed, kind of like an oil pad kind of situation. And you can see that we thought we were in really big trouble. The treatments went in 2009. So even up to like 6 years post-treatment, it looked like cheatgrass had taken off and that we were going to have a problem with cheatgrass at these sites. But then I was like, you know what? Let me just go back and look at it one more time. So more than about 10 years, we went back and looked at the sites, and the cheatgrass had pretty much gone away, even where we hadn't seeded. So there is a lot of resilience in these higher elevation sites. But I don't want you to get too complacent because we know things are changing. There's more drought, there's climate change. And also another thing that's changing is that cheatgrass is becoming adapted to higher elevation sites. So we do need to worry about it. We do need to be concerned and do some cheatgrass control, but I don't think we should think the sky is falling. Another caveat with the graph I just showed is that these sites were fenced. We have since removed those fences, so we'll be able to look at this with some more natural kind of grazing regimes, but that prior slide where the cheatgrass completely played out was a situation where we didn't have any grazing at all. So we probably are going to need to do some kind of weed control, but I want to give you a cautionary tale about 3 different cheatgrass control products that I've looked at. And the first one's kind of the old player that we know well, Amazopic or Plateau. And so in the photograph on the left, there's a site where we did just a 6 ounce per acre treatment. And then we had disturbances where we applied it. And we had some undisturbed area. And you can see we did a lot of good. We got a lot more sagebrush back in that site where we had applied it than where we had not. But on the other photograph, this is a site that's only about 300 feet higher in elevation, but we put the plateau down a little bit heavier and we nuked it. So we basically had too much herbicide. We had very little perennial plant establishment. And 5 years later, we had almost a solid stain of cheatgrass. And where we had applied no herbicide, it came back beautifully. So especially since a lot of you work in this area where it is more resilient, I just want to make sure that, there's a cost to applying these herbicides. And if you don't need it, go really light with that because you could have some potential negative consequences. Another couple of products that we've heard about at this conference, well, at least we talked about Indaziflam this morning, are also really useful products, but I also want to give a note of caution with these as well because they don't play well with seedings. So Indaziflam or Rejuvra is a great product. It works beautifully to control cheatgrass, but it's actually not a specific herbicide. So it doesn't target cheatgrass or annual plants or anything in particular. It just binds super tightly with soil particles and it inhibits root elongation. So any of your annual plants are going to be affected, but if you have an already established plant with the roots down below where that herbicide is, it'll be fine. So if you're trying to seed into it, you cannot use Indaziflam. And that also goes for this other product called Nutrifix, which I'm pretty excited about because it's not an herbicide. It's actually compatible with organic beef production. And it's like a boron-heavy fertilizer that just tends to be good for perennial grasses, but then not so good for cheatgrass. But with both of those products, you can't seed into it. So I don't have data on sagebrush, but these 2 graphs are from 2021, and we looked at bitterbrush and we looked at squirreltail. We have seedling density with the control in pink, and then the Indaziflam in green and the Nutrifix in blue. And you can see both those products really curtailed the germination of both of those desirable plants. So what can we do? All right, we need some kind of cheatgrass control. We want to go really light on our herbicides, but we also want to make sure we're not just ignoring the problem. One strategy we can do is we can really think about how cheatgrass works, and we can use some obstructions to seed dispersal, and that actually can have a pretty good effect on controlling it. So cheatgrass is like a mini-headed Medusa. When you chop it down, it comes back stronger. If you have an isolated plant, it'll produce about 40 times as much seed as a plant in a dense stand. So that comes into play if you have a situation where you've done your really good cheatgrass control and you have like just a few isolated plants. The problem is that they're going to produce really well. And if you have very little vegetation on your surface, you can have a big problem because those plants, the seeds disperse well in the absence of obstructions. So if there's not much vegetation or anything else to slow them down, they'll bounce around and spread out. And so your second generation of cheatgrass plants will also be pretty isolated from each other, and they'll also produce a lot of seed. And then within 2 generations, you kind of have that monoculture. And that's why it's such a problem after fire. Fire will actually reduce your cheatgrass seed bank by 98% sometimes if it's a hot fire. So it actually really reduces that seed bank, but you don't have anything to compete with the cheatgrass, and the few remaining plants disperse really well, and so it bounces back usually within 2 years. So what can we do? One thing we found is that you can interrupt this process just by creating obstructions on the soil surface. And so this kind of plays into what Heidi was talking about with the using the wood piles to provide shading. So similar idea here, we were looking at just creating some microsites of higher soil moisture, and our unexpected result was that it actually helped control cheatgrass too. And we looked at some fluorescently marked seed, and it's not rocket science, but when you have a flat surface, they spread out, and when you have holes, they kind of fall to the bottom of the hole and stay there. And so what that means is, you're still going to have maybe a few isolated cheatgrass plants that'll be highly productive that first season, but then the next year, they're all going to compete with each other, and then those plants will be like 40 times less productive. So you have a chance to get your something else established on the landscape. And so this is a site where we use just 4 ounces an acre of plateau, and then that's technique with the rough surface, and we got some really good results. And it was a lower elevation site that was very cheatgrassy when we started. And this was that graph I said I would explain better later. So these are those high elevation sites, and the difference between the solid line and the dash line is that rough surface. So that dash line was where we put the rough surface in, and the solid line was where we didn't. So even in the absence of seeding, just by doing that rough surface, we controlled a lot of the cheatgrass, and so it works at the low elevations as well as the high elevations. This is the tool that was developed. I don't know, this was a video. I'm not sure if I can make it go. I don't know how to make that work. But anyway, you can, you can do it with the tool that Ivan built and Derek built that will kind of dig and skip to create kind of a rough surface. Or you can do it with a mini excavators. So if you're out doing some wet meadow restorations and you've got some equipment around, you've got labor around, people, and if the soil is going to be disturbed, I wouldn't disturb it if it's not. But if you already have some soil disturbance, I would rough up those areas around the edges of your wet meadow restoration, because a little bit of topography is going to capture moisture, it's going to favor perennial plants, and it's going to help control annual plants. So it also really does work for helping survival. This is a site near Delta where we compared the rough surface seeding to the pothole to drill seeding, and it was a lot better survival with the pothole seeding. And we did this at Sims Mesa with Neil and Ken and some sage grouse habitat as well. Another thing you can do is you can use a brush mulch. So this is kind of also similar to Heidi's talk. If you have skeletons around of sagebrush, that's a valuable resource. So here we're looking at shrub percent cover versus year. Again, we have seeded versus unseeded, and now the dash line versus the solid line is a brush mulch treatment. So it's not a huge effect, but a little bit of brush will help your sagebrush to recover more quickly. So seeding sagebrush requires that you understand how it competes with other things. It doesn't compete well with grasses. It especially doesn't compete well with crested wheatgrass. This was a site from a CSU study 30 years after the fact where they had just put a tiny bit of crested wheatgrass in the seed mix, and 30 years later it was a monoculture. So I'd definitely leave that one out. I would keep the grass in your seed mixes to no more than 4 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So there's just a photo of all the sagebrush that we got established, and one of the reasons I think we had a lot of success was because we used super hyper local seed. There's a lot of debate in the plant materials world about cultivars versus locally collected seed, but I think for sagebrush the answer is clear. It needs to be locally collected. There's been studies that have shown that sagebrush seed from a given site will perform better at that site than sagebrush seed from just 1,000 feet away. So it's just hyper local, and I think the reason is because it has such a small seed. And so think about when you're walking around in Colorado in the springtime and you're hiking and you step on dry ground and then you step on mud and then you step on snow. And so sagebrush has to time its germination to hit it right when the soil's moist. It doesn't want to germinate under the snow, and it doesn't want to germinate when the soils are dry. And some old work by Susan Meyer showed that sagebrush from colder sites will wait longer at cold temperatures before it germinates. And so if you have poorly adapted seed, maybe your seed comes from a colder site and you throw it out there, then your acceptable germination window happens, but your seed is still waiting. It still thinks the winter's not over. So it pops later and it almost misses it entirely. Contrasting that with a case where you match your seed and it pops at the right time. And then I think this is why you see such a wide range of sagebrush seeding rates recommended in the literature. It's like an order of magnitude. There's no agreement on what rate you should seed sagebrush at. I think it's because some people have done it with well-adapted seed and they've seen one thing, and people with using it poor adapted seed have seen that you need a much higher rate. So I recommend, if you're going to do any seeding with sagebrush, to collect it yourself. That way you don't have to worry about what subspecies it is. You know, it hybridizes. It's confusing. It's hard to identify. It's hard to match it with a different site if you're trying to buy it commercially. One person can collect enough sagebrush seed in an hour for about an acre. And it's really low tech. You just spread it inside of a 5-gallon bucket. And then I recommend going out there and seeding it immediately. It doesn't store well. You could make use of our seed warehouse if you have some sagebrush seed you don't store, but it's best just to use it right away. You might not know exactly what your seeding rate is, and you might have some, debris or whatever that comes along with it. I don't think that really matters. I think if you can get it out there with a minimal competition from a site that's really close to where you're planting it, that's going to give you your best probability of success. This is mostly summarized in this document, which is available online. And I just want to thank everybody who helped out with this, particularly all our funding, a lot of which came from some energy companies, and then the cooperation we had from the BLM offices, and internally with CPW, and of course a lot of our technicians who worked on this over the years. Thanks. Time for questions or no? Jim, go ahead and pass that around.
Danielle, after you use the herbicide, and do you have to wait months or the next year before you actually put down seeds or seedlings? Is it a multi-year process or within a season process?
It depends on the herbicide, and I'm not an herbicide guru, but I can tell you that with Plateau, it's a matter of probably months. If you use like a 3-month plant back interval, you'll have a much better success. Within Indaziflam, there's some work coming out of Utah. Kevin Gunnell's shop over there has been looking at seeding back into Indaziflam, and it's like 4 years. So it really does depend on what herbicide you're looking at.
It was interesting to hear what you said about the after a fire, sorry, how the fire actually might destroy 98% of the cheatgrass seeds. Is there any kind of opportunity there to deal with the cheatgrass that's responding in a way that would eliminate those super seeders that come back in and just cause it to be dominated by cheatgrass again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key is getting the seed down and making it stay, because the soils are so friable at that point, and your erosion potential is so great that it's just hard to be successful with your seedings. But I've always wanted to try the pothole seeding after a fire. I haven't had that opportunity yet, but I think that would be one way you could create some microsites. You could keep your seed in place. You could slow down the cheatgrass. And maybe a light herbicide application too, if you knew it was super cheatgrassy before you started. I think that's really smart to think about the timing like that. Any kind of disturbance where you disturb the soil will also reduce your cheatgrass seeds. And so, or if you just have a really bad drought year and there's a poor cheatgrass crop. So thinking about just how many seeds you had that year is really important, and taking advantage of those things that naturally cause a dip in the numbers of seeds you're dealing with.